I'm sorry, but we're looking for someone younger, the HR manager said, barely glancing up from her tablet. At 72, Robert Hayes had heard those words before, but never during an interview for a security guard position. She didn't know he'd once guarded the president. She was about to find out. The morning sun reflected off the glass facade of Meridian Corporate Center, casting long shadows across the polished marble lobby. Robert Hayes stood at the entrance, adjusting his navy blue tie for the third time in 5 minutes. At 72, he knew he didn't look like the typical job applicant, but he needed this position more than his pride would admit. His Social Security check barely covered rent on his one-bedroom apartment, and the VA disability payments helped, but they weren't enough. Not since his wife Margaret had passed 2 years ago, taking with her not just his heart but also her teacher's pension that had kept them comfortable. Robert had burned through their modest savings paying for her cancer treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. The security guard position at Meridian wasn't glamorous, night shifts, minimum wage plus benefits, but it was honest work, and Robert Hayes had never been afraid of honest work. "Can I help you?" The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a practiced smile, looked up from her desk with barely concealed impatience. "I have a 10 a.m. interview with Ms. Patricia Wells in Human Resources," Robert said politely, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to giving clear, concise reports. The receptionist's smile faltered slightly as she looked him up and down. His suit was clean and pressed, but it was clearly from another decade. His shoes were polished to a military shine, but the leather showed years of wear. Everything about him screamed old man desperate for work. "Are you sure you have the right company?" she asked, fingers hovering over her keyboard. "Security applications are usually handled through our third-party contractor." "No, ma'am. I have an appointment with Ms. Wells directly." The position was posted through the state employment office. The receptionist sighed and typed something into her computer, her manicured nails clicking against the keys with obvious irritation. "Robert Hayes?" "Yes, ma'am." 11th floor. Suite 1147. Elevator bank to your right. Robert thanked her and walked toward the elevators, conscious of the way other people in the lobby gave him a wide berth. Young professionals in expensive suits, carrying leather briefcases and checking smartphones, moved around him like he was a piece of furniture someone had forgotten to remove. The elevator ride to the 11th floor was silent except for the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers. Robert studied his reflection in the polished steel doors. Gray hair neatly combed, clean-shaven face marked by lines that told stories he could never share, pale blue eyes that had seen too much but still held their alertness. He looked like exactly what he was, an old man who needed a job. Suite 1147 was marked with a simple placard, Human Resources, Patricia Wells, Director. Robert knocked twice and waited. "Come in." Patricia Wells was exactly what Robert had expected from her voice on the phone, mid-40s, sharply dressed in a charcoal gray business suit, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her office was all glass and chrome, with motivational posters on the walls and a window that looked out over the city skyline. She didn't look up from her tablet when Robert entered. "Mr. Hayes? Please, have a seat." Robert settled into the chair across from her desk, noting the way she continued to scroll through whatever was on her screen rather than make eye contact. He'd been in enough briefing rooms to recognize a power play when he saw one. Finally, Patricia looked up, and Robert saw her expression change the moment she took in his appearance. Her professional smile became strained, and she glanced at her tablet again as if confirming something. "So," she said, setting down the device with a slight frown. "You're applying for our overnight security position." "Yes, ma'am. I believe I'm well qualified for the role." Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying him with undisguised skepticism. "Mr. Hayes, can I be frank with you? I'd appreciate that. This position requires someone who can handle physical confrontations, work long hours on their feet, and respond quickly to emergency situations." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "I'm looking at your application, and while I see you have some military experience, that was over 50 years ago." Robert kept his expression neutral. Yes, ma'am. I served in Vietnam. And since then? Various positions. Security work, mostly. It was true, in the most limited sense possible. Robert had spent 35 years with the Secret Service after leaving the Marines, rising through the ranks to become part of the Presidential Protection Detail. He'd stood less than 10 feet from 4 different presidents, had taken a bullet meant for President Reagan, and had received commendations for heroism that were still classified. But his resume, carefully crafted to avoid revealing his true background, simply listed government security contractor for those decades. Patricia picked up his resume and frowned at it. Mr. Hayes, I have to ask, why are you applying for a minimum wage security position at your age? Shouldn't you be retired? The question hit harder than she probably intended. Robert thought about Margaret, about the medical bills, about the modest apartment where he now ate dinner alone every night. I prefer to stay active, ma'am. I believe I can contribute to your team. Patricia set down the resume and leaned forward, her expression taking on what she probably thought was a compassionate tone. Mr. Hayes, I appreciate your willingness to work, I really do. But let's be realistic here. This isn't a job for someone your age. We need someone who can handle themselves if things get dangerous. Someone who can work long shifts without fatigue affecting their judgment. Robert felt something cold settle in his stomach, not anger, exactly, but a familiar feeling from his military days when he'd encountered someone who confused rank with competence. I understand your concerns, ma'am. But I believe if you review my qualifications. Your qualifications from 50 years ago, Patricia interrupted. Mr. Hayes, I'm sorry, but we're looking for someone younger. Someone who can grow with the company, who represents our modern, dynamic image. She stood up, clearly intending to end the interview. I'm sure there are other opportunities more suited to someone of your experience level. Have you considered part-time retail? Many stores specifically hire senior citizens for greeting positions. Robert remained seated, his hands folded calmly in his lap. In his mind, he was back in a briefing room in Washington, D.C., listening to a young FBI agent explain why the Secret Service wasn't needed for a particular operation. That agent had learned differently when 3 shots rang out at a campaign rally in Ohio. Ms. Wells, Robert said quietly, I think there might be some information missing from my file. Patricia paused, her hand already reaching for the door handle. I'm sorry. My security clearance information. My commendations. My actual service record. Mr. Hayes, I have your resume right here. Military service from 1968 to 1972, then various security positions. That's hardly the complete picture, Robert finished. The positions I held after military service require a different kind of background check. One that your standard HR processes wouldn't access. Patricia's eyes narrowed. Mr. Hayes, if you're trying to inflate your qualifications. I'm not trying to do anything except get a fair evaluation for this position. The tension in the room was palpable. Patricia checked her watch, clearly wanting to move on to her next appointment. She'd already decided Robert wasn't worth her time, and nothing he said was going to change that. Mr. Hayes, I appreciate you coming in, but this interview is over. As I said, we're looking for someone younger, someone who... The office door opened without a knock. Patricia, I need you to... Oh. The man who entered was tall, silver-haired, and dressed in an expensive navy suit that fit him perfectly. Robert recognized the bearing immediately, military officer, probably high-ranking, definitely someone accustomed to command. The nameplate on Patricia's desk suddenly made sense. This was probably someone important enough to walk into HR offices without an appointment. I'm sorry, the man said, looking between Patricia and Robert. I didn't realize you were in an interview. It's fine, Mr. Davidson, Patricia said quickly. We were just finishing up. Davidson. Robert's memory, trained by decades of briefings and security assessments, immediately placed the name. James Davidson, CEO of Meridian Corporation. Former Navy Admiral. Medal of Honor recipient. A man whose picture had been in Robert's briefing files more than once during his Secret Service days. "Actually," Robert said, standing slowly, "I don't believe we are finished." Patricia's face flushed. "Mr. Hayes, as I explained." "Patricia," Davidson interrupted, his attention now focused entirely on Robert. "What position is Mr. Hayes?" Robert supplied. "Robert Hayes. I'm applying for the overnight security position." Davidson's eyes sharpened, studying Robert with the kind of assessment that came from years of evaluating personnel under pressure. Robert met his gaze steadily, letting his own background show in his posture, his bearing, the way he stood at a modified position of attention without thinking about it. "Security," Davidson repeated slowly. "And Ms. Wells here was explaining why you wouldn't be suitable?" "She was explaining that I'm too old," Robert said simply. "That the company needs someone younger, more dynamic." Davidson's expression didn't change, but Robert caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "I see. And what's your background, Mr. Hayes?" Patricia stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Mr. Davidson, as I was explaining to Mr. Hayes, his qualifications are somewhat dated. Military service in Vietnam, then various security positions, but nothing that would." "Various security positions," Davidson repeated, his attention still on Robert. "What kind of security, Mr. Hayes?" Robert hesitated. His instinct, trained over decades, was to keep his background classified, to deflect and redirect. But something about Davidson's manner, the way he was studying Robert's face, suggested that evasion wouldn't work here. "Government security, sir." "Federal level." "Federal level." Davidson took a step closer. "Mr. Hayes, would I be correct in assuming that your actual service record is somewhat more comprehensive than what appears on this resume?" "Yes, sir." "And would I also be correct in assuming that there are elements of your background that require a higher level of security clearance to access?" "Yes, sir." Patricia looked between the two men, clearly lost. "Mr. Davidson, I don't understand what." "Patricia," Davidson said without taking his eyes off Robert, "step outside please." "Sir?" "Step outside. Close the door behind you." Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but she did as instructed, leaving Robert and Davidson alone in the office. Davidson waited until the door clicked shut, then walked around to Patricia's desk and sat down heavily. "Mr. Hayes, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer." "Yes, sir." "Did you ever serve in a protective capacity for any U.S. government officials?" Robert's training screamed at him to deflect, to maintain operational security even decades after retirement. But looking at Davidson, seeing the ribbons on his lapel, the way he carried himself, the security clearance pin that was barely visible on his suit jacket, Robert made a decision. "Yes, sir." "What level?" "Presidential." Davidson was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drummed against the desk. "How long?" 35 years, sir." "Secret Service." "Retired?" "Yes, sir." 2 years ago." Davidson leaned back in the chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Mr. Hayes, do you have any idea who I am?" "Yes, sir." "Admiral James Davidson, retired. Currently CEO of Meridian Corporation. Medal of Honor recipient for actions in the Gulf War. And do you know why I might recognize your name?" Robert's memory scrolled through the hundreds of briefings, the thousands of names and faces that had crossed his desk during his career. Then it clicked. "The Homeland Security Advisory Board, sir. You were briefed on the reorganization of presidential protection protocols in 2019. "That's right." "And do you remember who led that briefing?" "I do, sir. Because your name was on every single classified document that crossed my desk for 6 months. Robert Hayes, Senior Agent, Presidential Protection Detail. The man who took a bullet for President Reagan. The man who identified and neutralized the security threat at the G7 summit in 2018. Robert said nothing, but he felt something shifting in his chest, a recognition that had been missing for 2 years, since he'd cleaned out his office and turned in his badge. Davidson stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "Mr. Hayes, what the hell are you doing applying for a minimum wage security job?" The question was asked with genuine concern, not judgment, and Robert found himself answering honestly. "I need the work, sir. My wife passed away 2 years ago. Medical bills. I'm not financially secure." Davidson turned around, his expression grim. "The government doesn't take care of its own, does it?" "The government did its job, sir. I'm just adjusting to civilian life." "Adjusting?" Davidson shook his head. "Mr. Hayes, I'm going to make you an offer." Davidson walked back to the desk and picked up Robert's resume, scanning it with new understanding. "This is a hell of a creative writing exercise," he said with a slight smile. "Government security contractor. Various federal positions. You managed to summarize 35 years of service to your country without revealing a single classified detail." "Yes, sir. Operational security protocols. Even in retirement?" "Especially in retirement, sir." Davidson nodded approvingly. "Mr. Hayes, I'm going to ask Patricia to come back in here, and I'm going to offer you a position. Not the security guard job you applied for." Robert felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. "Sir? I need a director of corporate security. Someone who understands threat assessment, crisis management, and personnel protection. Someone who's seen enough of the world to know the difference between a real threat and a false alarm." The office door opened and Patricia re-entered, her face carefully neutral but her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Patricia," Davidson said, "I need you to prepare an offer letter for Mr. Hayes." "For the security position?" she asked, her tone suggesting she thought this was a mistake. "No. For Director of Corporate Security." Patricia's mouth fell open. "Sir, that's a senior management position. The salary range is—" "I know what the salary range is. I also know that Mr. Hayes is uniquely qualified for the role." Patricia looked at Robert with new confusion, trying to reconcile the old man in the worn suit with a senior management position. "Sir, with all due respect, Mr. Hayes' resume doesn't show any management experience, and his background is primarily—" "Patricia," Davidson interrupted, "what's our company policy regarding veteran hiring preferences?" We have a commitment to hiring qualified veterans, sir." "And what's our policy regarding age discrimination?" Patricia's face flushed. "We don't discriminate based on age, sir." "Good. Because I'd hate to think that our HR department was violating federal law by refusing to hire someone based on their age rather than their qualifications." The silence in the room was deafening. Patricia's eyes darted between Davidson and Robert, clearly realizing that she'd stepped into something much bigger than a routine job interview. "Now," Davidson continued, "Mr. Hayes, are you interested in the director position?" Robert felt like he was in a dream. For hours ago, he'd been a desperate old man hoping for a minimum wage job. Now he was being offered a position that would not only solve his financial problems but would also give him something he thought was gone forever: purpose. "Yes, sir. I'm very interested." "Excellent. Patricia, I want the offer letter prepared today. And I want you to personally ensure that Mr. Hayes' background check is expedited through the appropriate federal channels." "Sir, our standard background check process won't be sufficient for this position. Mr. Hayes will need to provide his federal security clearance information for verification. The process will take some time, but I want him started immediately." Patricia nodded, making notes on her tablet with slightly shaking hands. "Oh, and Patricia?" "Yes, sir. I want you to attend Mr. Hayes' orientation session. I think it would be valuable for you to learn about his background and experience. It might help you better evaluate veteran candidates in the future." The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. Patricia nodded again, her face now pale. Davidson turned back to Robert. "Mr. Hayes, welcome to Meridian Corporation. Your first assignment will be to conduct a comprehensive security assessment of our facilities and personnel. I suspect you'll find several areas that need immediate attention. Yes, sir. I look forward to it. One more thing, Davidson said, walking toward the door. Patricia, please arrange for Mr. Hayes to attend our next board meeting. I'd like him to present his initial security assessment to our directors. As Davidson left the office, Patricia and Robert were left alone together. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and both of them knew it. Mr. Hayes, Patricia said quietly, I need to apologize. Ma'am? I made assumptions about you based on your age and appearance. That was wrong, and it was unprofessional. Robert studied her face, seeing genuine remorse alongside the fear of potential consequences. In his experience, people revealed their true character not when things were going well, but when they were forced to confront their mistakes. Ms. Wells, he said finally, in my experience, the best people are the ones who can recognize when they've made an error and learn from it. I appreciate that, sir. And I want you to know that this won't happen again. I believe you. Patricia looked down at her tablet, then back up at Robert. Can I ask you something? Of course. How do you do it? How do you stay so calm? I just completely humiliated myself in front of the CEO, and you're acting like nothing happened. Robert smiled for the first time since entering the office. Ms. Wells, when you've been shot at by people who really wanted to kill you, a job interview doesn't seem quite so stressful. 3 months later, Robert Hayes sat in the executive conference room on the 20th floor of Meridian Corporate Center, reviewing his security assessment report one final time before the board meeting. The view from this office was spectacular, the entire city spread out below, with the mountains visible in the distance on clear days like today. His new office was 2 floors up from HR, with windows that actually opened and a door that people knocked on before entering. The nameplate read Robert Hayes, Director of Corporate Security, and every time he saw it, he felt a small surge of pride that he thought was gone forever. The transformation hadn't been easy. Learning new computer systems, adapting to corporate culture, figuring out how to translate military and federal security protocols into the private sector, it had all required adjustments. But Robert had discovered that the fundamental skills were the same: assess threats, protect people, plan for contingencies. More importantly, he discovered that his colleagues actually listened to him. His recommendations weren't dismissed because of his age, they were implemented because they made sense. When he suggested upgrading the building's access control systems, the facilities manager had his purchase order approved within a week. When he identified potential vulnerabilities in their executive travel protocols, the travel department had immediately asked for his input on revisions. The door to the conference room opened, and Davidson entered, followed by the 8 other members of Meridian's board of directors. Ladies and gentlemen, Davidson announced, I'd like you to meet Robert Hayes, our Director of Corporate Security. Robert will be presenting his initial security assessment today. Robert stood and nodded to the board members, a mix of business executives, former government officials, and industry experts. A few months ago, he would have been intimidated by a room full of people whose decisions affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. Now, he simply saw it as another briefing. Thank you, Admiral Davidson, Robert began, using Davidson's military title as he had since their first conversation. Over the past 3 months, I've conducted a comprehensive review of Meridian's security posture, focusing on physical security, personnel protection, information security, and crisis response protocols. He clicked to his first slide, a photograph of the building's main entrance. I'll start with the good news. Meridian's physical security infrastructure is generally solid. Your access control systems are current, your surveillance coverage is comprehensive, and your security staff is professional and well-trained. He clicked to the next slide. However, I've identified several areas where improvements are both necessary and cost-effective. For the next 20 minutes, Robert walked the board through his findings and recommendations. He spoke about badge access protocols, emergency evacuation procedures, and threat assessment matrices. He explained the difference between deterrent security and protective security, and why both were necessary for a company of Meridian's profile. The board members asked good questions, and Robert found himself enjoying the intellectual challenge of explaining complex security concepts to intelligent people who weren't necessarily experts in his field. Finally, Robert said, clicking to his last slide, "I want to address something that isn't typically covered in security assessments, but which I believe is crucial for a company that wants to maintain both high security standards and high ethical standards." The slide showed a simple graphic: security culture versus security theater. True security isn't just about systems and procedures. It's about creating a culture where everyone understands that security is everyone's responsibility, and where people feel empowered to report concerns without fear of retaliation. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each board member. A security culture is built on trust, communication, and mutual respect. It's about recognizing that the janitor who notices something unusual after hours might be just as important to your security as the most sophisticated electronic systems. It's about understanding that diversity of perspective and experience makes your entire organization stronger and more resilient. Robert paused, thinking about his own experience with Patricia Wells, about how different his life might have been if Davidson hadn't walked into that office. It's also about recognizing that sometimes the most valuable people don't look like what you expect them to look like. When he finished his presentation, the board erupted in applause. Davidson was smiling broadly, and several other board members were nodding approvingly. "Outstanding work, Robert," said Dr. Sarachin, a board member who served as president of the local university. "Your recommendations are thorough and practical." "I have a question," said another board member, a former FBI director named Marcus Webb. "Your background obviously gives you unique insights into security issues. But I'm curious, how has the transition from federal service to corporate security been?" Robert considered the question carefully. "Sir, the fundamental mission is the same: protect people and assets from threats. But the corporate environment has some advantages that government service doesn't. Such as flexibility, for one. When I recommend a security enhancement, I don't have to wait for congressional approval or navigate 6 layers of bureaucracy. If it makes sense and the resources are available, it gets implemented." Several board members chuckled at that. "But more importantly," Robert continued, "I've found that the private sector is often more willing to invest in people. To recognize that experience and expertise come in many forms, and that age and appearance aren't reliable indicators of competence." He looked directly at Davidson. 3 months ago, I was unemployed and feeling like my skills and experience were obsolete. Today, I'm doing the most meaningful work of my career, and I'm being valued for what I know rather than dismissed for how old I am." After the meeting, Robert walked back to his office, feeling the same sense of satisfaction he'd once gotten from a successful protective operation. His phone buzzed with a text message from his neighbor, Mrs. Chen. "Saw your interview in the Business Journal. Margaret would be so proud." Robert smiled and put the phone away. Through his office window, he could see the building's main entrance, where a steady stream of employees was entering for the start of the business day. Young and old, every background imaginable, all of them contributing to something larger than themselves. His computer chimed with an email notification. The sender was Patricia Wells. "Mr. Hayes," the message read, "I wanted to let you know that we've just hired 3 more veterans for various positions throughout the company, including a 68-year-old former Navy engineer for our facilities management team. I thought you'd be pleased to know that your example has helped us recognize talent we might have previously overlooked. Thank you for teaching all of us to look beyond the surface. Patricia." Robert leaned back in his chair and smiled. Sometimes the best victories weren't the ones you won for yourself, but the ones that opened doors for other people. His phone rang. The caller ID showed Admiral Davidson. "Robert, how did you feel about the board meeting?" "Very positive, sir. The board members asked excellent questions." "Good. I have another assignment for you, if you're interested." "Of course, sir. The Department of Homeland Security has asked me to serve on a new advisory committee on private sector security. I'd like you to be my technical advisor for the committee." Robert felt his pulse quicken. Sir, that would be an honor. Excellent. Oh, and Robert? Yes, sir. Patricia Wells has asked to transfer to our Diversity and Inclusion Department. She wants to focus on improving our veteran hiring programs. I told her I'd consider it if you thought she was the right person for the job. Robert thought about Patricia, about the genuine remorse she'd shown, about the changes she'd already implemented in HR. Sir, I think she'd be excellent in that role. I thought you might say that. You have good instincts about people, Robert. After Davidson hung up, Robert sat quietly in his office, looking out at the city below. 6 months ago, he'd been a forgotten old man eating dinner alone and worrying about paying his bills. Today, he was helping to shape security policy for one of the region's largest employers, and his expertise was being sought at the federal level. But more than that, he was part of something again. He had purpose, respect, and the knowledge that his experience mattered. Sometimes, Robert reflected, the best second chances came disguised as dead ends. And sometimes, the people who seemed least likely to help you turned out to be the ones who changed everything. His computer chimed with another email, this one from a job applicant, a 65-year-old former police chief applying for a security analyst position. Robert opened the man's resume and started reading, already planning how he would make sure this candidate got a fair evaluation based on his qualifications, not his age. Because everyone deserved the chance to prove their worth. Everyone deserved to be seen for who they really were, not dismissed for who they appeared to be. And Robert Hayes, Director of Corporate Security for Meridian Corporation, was going to make sure that happened.